So with patch 1.1, we got some changes to the effect hit rate globally within the game. A global mechanic was changed where in version 1.0, the level scaling of effect res on enemies used to be an increase of 0.5% per level, starting from level 51 all the way up to level 100 with a maximum of 25%. And then the change now is it increases by 0.4% per level, starting from 51 up to level 75, and it will no longer increase after level 75, plus the maximum is now only 10%. So what this means is that the maximum effect resistance an enemy can have is now 40%, and there are only a handful of enemies that have that, and those are reserved for most of the bosses in the game like Kokolia, Svarog, the Deer Boss, and the Doomsday Beast. Most bigger enemies, elite enemies, and other bosses like Gepard and Bronya have a 20%, and then the maximum, they're going to be reaching 30% effect resistance. And then the smaller enemies, they're around 10 to 0%, and so when we reach that maximum level, they're going to have either 20% or less. And so effect resistance plays a pretty huge part in this game's end game. Nihility characters rely a lot on applying their debuffs, but there are also plenty of other characters that aren't Nihility that have a chance to apply some kind of extra debuff with their attack, like an extra burn or freeze chance or shock chance. Now that we have all of this information, there are a couple of effect hit rate benchmarks to keep in mind. And so let's start with how this affects Silverwolf since she just released. At Trace level 6, we have an 80% base chance in order to apply the weakness debuff from our skill. And Trace level 6, in my opinion, is a good spot for a decent chunk of the player base right now who are especially free to play or even low spending. And so that's why I'm choosing to focus at this level and not the max level of 10. So with an 80% base chance, many of the larger high level enemies will have a chance to resist the weakness implant with no extra effect hit rate. Enemies with a 30% effect resistance have a 56% chance to resist this debuff. Enemies with a 40% effect res have a 48% chance to resist the debuff, and 20% effect res enemies have a 64% chance to resist the debuff. So these chances are in fact pretty low, especially if we don't have any effect hit rate. Enemies in the game with a 40% effect resistance are not that common. They are reserved for boss type enemies like Svarog and Kokolia and some of the other bigger bosses. Enemies with a 30% effect resistance are going to be some of the smaller bosses like Gepard and Bronya and a bunch of the elite mobs. So those are actually going to be pretty common. And of course, they're only going to reach that 30% effect resistance once they hit level 75. So all of this stuff you're going to run into once you start challenging the Memory of Chaos. Now, if we get this to level 10, we get 85% base chance. And at that point, the real chance increases to 59.5% for 40% res enemies and 51% for 30% effect res enemies. And in order to guarantee a weakness implant at trace level 10 is to build 96% effect hit rate. At trace level 8, where we have 82.5% base chance, you need to build 102% effect hit rate. And then at level 6, you need 108% effect hit rate to guarantee. To be honest though, we're probably fine with around 90 to 95%, maybe even going down as low as 80 to 85%. So that means in order to hit a 80% real chance to apply our weakness debuff, we need 87.5% effect hit rate to apply the weakness debuff to an enemy with 40% effect res. And that's if we're at trace level 6. And at this level, we're only going to be able to hit the trace that gives us an extra 4% effect hit rate, since the next node for this is Ascension 5 and level 75. So that's a lot of resources in order to get the extra 6 plus 8%, which is 14%. And so with that in mind, if we have an S5 before the tutorial mission starts light cone from the companion mission, we're going to hit 44% effect hit rate. That means we're about halfway there to hit that 90% real chance to apply our weakness debuff to enemies with 40% effect res, which is the max. From there, a 5-star body relic with an effect hit rate main stat is going to give us 43.2%. So at that point, that should be about enough. It's not exactly 87.5, but it's close enough. And you're probably going to get lucky with some of your subsets as well. So you might get an extra 5, maybe even 10% effect hit rate. I will say that anything below 80% to apply our weakness debuff is too low. Especially if you play Pokemon, you'll know that everyone hates missing a Hydro Pump with that 80% base accuracy. That shit misses all the time. So that's just Silver Wolf, but there's a lot of other characters in the game who aren't Nihility that don't really want to be building effect hit rate for a main stat for their relics. And the base chance to apply those effects are kind of all over the place. Sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's 80, sometimes it's 50, and sometimes it's 65. So let's go down the list and take a look at all those characters that have those extra effects that aren't quite a Nihility character. The first one is March 7th, and she has an ultimate here that has a base chance to freeze the enemies. And that base chance is only 50% base. So considering that an 80% base chance for Silver Wolf took 80% extra effect hit rate, you can imagine that in order to guarantee a freeze, it's going to take a whole lot of effect hit rate. So it's probably not viable to build for this freeze chance. There's also tons of enemies that resist freeze as well. So in those matchups, you're just not going to be freezing anything. The next one is Serval, and she has a skill that has a chance to apply shocked to enemies. This is an 80% base chance, but it will increase to 20% once you get a bonus trace. 100% base chance is a lot better, and it's definitely more viable to build some effect hit rate to increase the consistency of applying shock to all of the enemies in the game. With 100% base chance, without any effect hit rate, your real effect chance is 60%. With 30% enemies, it's 70% real chance. That's really easy to calculate. All you gotta do is subtract the enemy resistance from 100, and then you'll get the real effect chance. So in order to hit our shock 100% of the time with Serval, we need 66% effect hit rate for 40% enemies and 42%, almost 43% for 30% enemies. But that difference between 42 and 43 really is not that big of a deal. It's 1%. The consistency is already there. And again, like I said before, hitting 90% or even 80% is good enough. So we don't exactly have to hit 42% or 66%. We can definitely go a little bit lower than that. Serval also has some built-in effect hit rate from her traces. She's able to get an extra 14%. And 14% brings us to about an 80% real base chance for those types of enemies. So that's about the same accuracy as a Hydro Pump, which is not great, but it's not terrible. The next character on my list was Himeko, and she has a trace that will apply a burn chance with a 50% base chance whenever she uses an attack. 50% is the same as March's ult, which is incredibly low. And so to give you guys a better picture of how much effect hit rate we need in order to guarantee with 50% base chance, you're going to need 233% effect hit rate to guarantee against a 40% res enemy, so against bosses. And then against those 30% res enemies like Gepard and Bronya, you need 185% effect hit rate. That's just way too much, and you definitely want to be focusing on other things. And so without any effect hit rate, the real effect chance of this happening to those types of enemies is 35% for bosses like Gepard and Bronya, and then 30% for bosses like Svarog and Cocolia. That is equivalent to trying to hit a Guillotine or Fissure from Pokemon, and you barely hit those. The next one is Heng, and he has an ability to slow enemies with his skills whenever he hits a crit. And this is a 100% base chance, so like Serval. And this is totally viable to build some effect hit rate so that you can guarantee a slow whenever you hit a crit, or at least have a high chance. And so just like Serval, the numbers are all the same. So for 30% enemies like Gepard and Bronya, it's 42% or 43%. And then for bosses like Svarog and Cocolia, it's 66%. And then to hit that 80% mark, it's about 14% or 33%. So building a little bit of effect hit rate to more consistently hit slows whenever we get crits is, I think in my opinion, definitely something you want to build on your Heng. At least through substats and not through the main stat of your body piece. The next character we have is Sampo, and he has a talent that has a 65% base chance to inflict wind shear whenever he attacks. 65% is pretty low, not as low as 50%, but will require a lot of effect hit rate. Thankfully, he is a Nihility character, so you will probably want to be building effect hit rate on him anyway, so that he can more consistently apply his other wind shear effects. His ultimate has that 100% base chance, so you should at least be building for his ultimate. So the 100 base chance benchmark is the same as Heng Heng and Serval. But for 65% base chance, the real effect chance that we're getting here is 45.5% for bosses like Gepard and Bronya, and 39% for bosses like Svarog and Cocolia. In order to get that 100% application of the wind shear for this guy, we need 119% for the Gepards and Bronyas, and 156% for the Svarogs and Cocolias. To hit that 80%, we only need 75% for the Gepards and Bronyas, and 105% for the Cocolias and Svarogs. The next one on the list is Hook, and she has a skill that has a chance to apply Burn. And this is a 100% base chance, so no reason to rehash the same information. She's the same as Serval, Yanqing, and Sampo's ultimate. Pela, likewise, is very similar. Her ultimate has a 100% base chance, as well as she has a E4 Eidolon, which has a 100% base chance as well to reduce ice res. The last character that I have on my list, and I'm sure that there might be other characters as well, but Yanqing has a chance to freeze enemies at a 65% base chance. This happens with his talent whenever he does his follow-up attack. So the 65% base chance is just like Sampo, and to reiterate the 100% chance to apply this debuff, it's 119 for the Gepards and Bronyas, and 156 for the Svarogs and Cocolias. However, as a hunt character, you probably don't want to be building for effect hit rate. You definitely want to be building Yanqing for as much damage as possible, with things like extra crit damage, because Yanqing gives him so much extra crit rate already. However, it would be interesting to see a Yanqing build where we do build for effect hit rate to guarantee freezes whenever he does his follow-up attack. I honestly think that that's an interesting strategy, and I personally have not seen many people mention it. I personally might go down this path and see if it's viable, and even if it's not, I'm probably gonna have fun with it. But for me personally, I probably won't want to hit that 100%. I'll probably go for an 80% or a 90%. So those are all of the characters in the game that have extra debuffs, and how the new effect hit rate changes affect how much effect hit rate we need in order to apply those debuffs. This is definitely all essential information to know, and let me know down in the comments if this video helped you out or not. And if you're interested in how more of the mechanics work in Honkai Star Rail, I have a video based on Weakness Break.